popular, but we're going to start. I am very glad to see everybody here today. Thank you so much for attending the last of this year's Faculty Works in Progress programs. And this one, and my hope is that we will all be back together again next year, enjoying listening to one another's work in progress over lunch supplied by the Dean's office. This is a shared venture by the Humanities Center and the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. Hi, Uta. Uta will close our program today. But today is this has been an extraordinary year. We all know that. And part of what's been so extraordinary is that we have transitioned all of our programs to remote. And as I have been reflecting on the success of the programs this year and the accommodations that have been made as we share our work and as we adjust the work that we do, and that was the pre-conversation that you were listening to, what kinds of new initiatives, new urgencies have we taken up in the face of dramatic changes, both the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, the racisms that we have witnessed, and the ways in which our colleagues have tried to adjust. The verb for this year has been pivot. And I have taken to using the verb pirouette, because watching my colleagues, it's not just one turn, it's one graceful turn after another, as our colleagues have created a new way of sort of dancing. And today what we are showcasing, and I'm so grateful to Gretchen and Philip Ty and Gretchen Heefner for presenting their an introduction to their slice of a much larger project that has been part of this pirouette, and that is the Northeastern University Pandemic Teaching Initiative. On a dime, our colleagues have discovered that they needed to accommodate their research or bring their research to bear on the circumstances of our own moment. And Professors Heefner and Ty created a wonderful module for the Pandemic Teaching Initiative. I urge everybody to please go have a look at it. And theirs is on disease, diplomacy, and science in the Cold War, a way of teaching us about past pandemics and its relationship to future pandemics. So I would like to now introduce Professor Tim Brown, Chair of the History Department, who in turn will introduce his colleagues. Tim?
Thanks, Lori. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gretchen Heefner and Dr. Philip Ty. Gretchen Heefner teaches and researches the global Cold War. She created the Global Cold War Seminar here at Northeastern, which Philip Ty is currently teaching. And I understand from Gretchen that this seminar actually is what led to the collaboration around the module that's being discussed today. Gretchen's currently working on a book entitled From the Red Desert to the Red Planet, which is a fantastic title, and a title that makes you want to read the book immediately as soon as it comes out. The book's about military engineering in extreme environments since World War II. She's also working on a very timely project on the environmental history of the US military, which I think is a topic that's going to become more and more important and be part of conversations around sustainability, resilience, the environment, Green New Deal, so on and so forth. Philip Ty is a historian of modern China. He's author of China's War on Smuggling, Law, Economic Life, and the Making of the Modern State. His research and teaching interests include legal history, economic history, and diplomatic history. During the 2022-23 academic year, he'll be in residence at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study on an ACLS Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship, and there he'll be working on his new project, A History of Underground Economies in China during the Cold War. Phil Ty and Gretchen Heefner are part of a cohort who came into the history department a few years back. It seems like it was only yesterday, but in fact, they are now associate, along with a couple of the colleagues that they came into the department at the same time with. And they are a powerful force within the history department, doing lots of interesting and very valuable work. And I'm very excited to see what they're going to present today. So please join me in welcoming them.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for that kind introduction, and to the Humanities Center for having us, Philip and I, here today, presenting on our teaching module on disease, diplomacy, and science during the Cold War. And here's what we're going to do today. So Gabby, if you could just forward to the next slide, has a sort of brief outline on it for everyone. We're going to give you I'm going to give you a sense of why Philip and I decided to collaborate on this. Tim alluded to it a bit in his opening comments. And then we're each going to give you a brief overview of some of the materials that we put together for this module. And it's kind of a weird beast what we're doing today, right? So bear with us. The goal is sort of twofold. One is to just kind of give you some information about the Cold War and pandemics, sort of facts and sort of stories that you can put in your back pocket and take with you. And two, it's to orient you to this module that we put together, or unit that we put together for the college. And I've just put a couple of images up here. Sorry, the images are so tiny, but please do visit the college's pandemic teaching website for more. The module that Philip and I put together is sort of 3-in-1. So you could either teach this sort of unit on smallpox, the unit on influenza pandemics during the Cold War, or you could glom them all together. So you can pick and choose. And I would recommend, I think in our comments today, we're both going to sort of give an overview of some of the materials. It'll seem pretty cursory because it is, in fact, and you're welcome to check out some of the readings or videos or discussion questions or sort of lesson plans that we have that we've created for you on the site. So of course, we welcome you to do that. So now just a little bit on the collaboration that sort of Philip and I have embarked upon. And sort of last year, like really literally a year ago, when the world was sort of shutting down around us, the college, of course, sent out a call for teaching modules on how we might be able to sort of contextualize and gain perspective on the COVID-19 crisis that was really unfolding, right, as we were thinking about it. And so Philip and I kind of decided, we kind of immediately knew that what we needed to address was what we might call the sort of stories of the diplomacy of disease that were circulating in the news. And these are stories of blame, right? Name calling, global quarantine, the closing of borders, right? Some of you might know or be one of those people who was sort of stuck somewhere in April, not sure you could get home. But against sort of amidst these recriminations, there were also calls for cooperation, right? Experts exchanging information and materials, plane loads of PPE sort of being flown around the world as signs of goodwill. And while all of this seemed really sort of terribly novel and unpredictable and sort of unprecedented to us at the time, in fact, as historians, we know that nothing is quite new, right? We've seen some of these things before. Indeed, throughout the Cold War, the period that Philip and I, of course, both teach in and research, and again, we both have taught this Global Cold War seminar in the history department over the past sort of 5 or 6 years. And so we have kind of not infrequent conversations about how to teach the class and what kinds of things that we might want to teach in the Cold War. And so while the Iron Curtain could really hardly keep pathogens from crossing borders, right? And it couldn't stop cycles of recrimination and blame once pathogens did cross borders during the Cold War. And at the same time, the international community, despite I think really being divided by geopolitical and ideological competition, at times managed to come together and deal with and even contain diseases. And that's the sort of historical context and background that we wanted to bring to the current crisis. And we thought students might benefit from this sort of deep, it's not that deep of a history really, the Cold War, but this longer time frame. And then it allows students to ask questions about sort of what worked well in past pandemics, what didn't, right? Is it possible to learn lessons from what has come before? And the question that I always like to have students ask is that even a question we want to ask, right? Do we care if there's lessons to be learned? And how do we even look for those anyways? But first, I have a quick question for all of you, and just unmute yourself and yell out an answer if you have one. I'm going to turn to now talking about my sort of piece of our teaching unit, which is on smallpox. And so I just want to know, can anybody tell us why I am framing smallpox as a Cold War story? I don't even know if you can unmute yourself, but if you can, anyone know why, have a thought on why the Cold War might be, the smallpox might be a Cold War story? Then you have a lot to learn. Gabby, if you could forward the next slide, I will move on in to that. So the answer to that is, I guess my rhetorical question was, smallpox was eradicated during the Cold War, right? Smallpox was eradicated in 1980. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared, and I quote, "The world and all of its peoples have won freedom from smallpox," right? This is the first time the international community had gotten rid of a disease. It is a big deal. Just last year, the World Health Organization, the director of the World Health Organization declared it was the greatest public triumph in human history. And other scholars and medical historians have compared it to the feat of landing a man on the moon, right? This was an incredible task, and it was indeed impressive. Gabby, you can forward to the next slide. The disease is gone, other than a few vials that I should tell you the Soviets and the Americans both kept. So the Soviets, now the Russians, and the Americans both have vials of smallpox sitting in some lab somewhere around the world. But let me explain to you why it was such an incredible feat. In the 20th century alone, smallpox has been around, for hundreds of years. In the 20th century alone, 300 million people died of smallpox. That's 300 million people. The virus killed about a third of the people that were infected by it and left many others disfigured and scarred for life. It was a terrible illness. And the map you see here shows when smallpox was eradicated from various parts of the world. And key for us today in thinking about this is these sort of dark orange and red areas. And those are the places where smallpox was endemic and throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. So these are the areas that the World Health Organization is going to be very concerned about in the 1960s and 1970s when it ramps up its smallpox eradication program. Just FYI, the last smallpox outbreak in the United States was in 1949. I'm so sorry, family phone is ringing. And so Gabby, if you move on to the next slide, please. So the man pictured here is Donald Henderson, who was the World Health Organization director of the Global Smallpox Eradication Program called the SEP. He also happened to have been a member of the CDC in the United States, and he declared smallpox a Cold War victory, which is why I'm sort of placing smallpox in this Cold War frame. And he was not entirely wrong. In the mid-1960s, for various reasons that I can talk about in the Q&A if people are interested, the Americans and the Soviets decided to collaborate on this goal through, of course, this international organization, the WHO. And the quote that you see below here, which you don't need to read, it's just there, and the essay that follows, which are both posted on Canvas, which are part of the teaching module, Henderson describes the ways that, and I say the ways the WHO did this, right? And so he describes the WHO in the 1960s and 1970s as a discursive space where scientists and public health experts from around the world could really meet. And number one, agree that smallpox was a global problem that had to be solved. And number two, find solutions for that global problem, right? And what really comes through in Henderson's writing, which the students look at, is that while this was certainly a Cold War collaboration and a Cold War victory in the way he frames it, this really took place under the radar. This was not a policy or program of high politics. This was sort of mid-level technocrats working together, talking, making plans, and imagining what they thought was possible. And the historian Erez Manela, who the students will also read in his essays, also linked on Canvas, in fact, argues that the World Health Organization's smallpox efforts, the smallpox eradication program, should actually be seen as an example of the ways in which the international community was moving away from the sort of bipolar Cold War, East-West, Eurocentric way of thinking and organizing things, and towards a more global sensibility, where we'll see ideas of global governance and international institutions really leading the way, or sort of creating avenues and channels through which transnational actors and people will start to think about the world and what's possible. And so Erez Manela locates this program as being a really important moment of transition in ideas about international sort of planning and global governance. In any case, the WHO certainly served an important function as being a place where sort of scientists and public health experts could come and meet and organize and plan and talk about what to do about smallpox, and ended up being ultimately, of course, this successful campaign. And if Gabby, if you could forward them to the next slide, it'd be great. And given the success of this campaign, in 1980, right, smallpox is eradicated, it's gone, it no longer exists. This is not a disease we need to worry about today. There were, of course, plenty of headlines last spring about, could we compare COVID-19 to smallpox eradication? Could that program, give us a sort of great sense of possibility, or were there lessons that we could actually learn from it? And the answer is, we frankly don't actually know enough about the smallpox eradication program to draw particularly good lessons from it. And historian Sanjay Bhattacharya, whose work the students are also going to read in this module, has closely studied smallpox programming in South Asia. And he describes the story of how the smallpox eradication program in India in particular, his work is on the smallpox eradication program in India. And he describes smallpox eradication more broadly as what he calls a beautiful 1,000 piece puzzle, he says. But he says, we really only have one or two pieces in place right now. And so of this huge mosaic of stories, we really only have one or two that we know particularly well. And not surprisingly, the stories that we tend to know most about are from people like Henderson. They're from World Health Organization officials. They're from policymakers. They're sort of from these official documents. And those are important stories to be sure. Sometimes they're quite heroic stories, but they're incomplete. And as I explained to my students in the module, in order to learn any lessons, or even the right lessons, right, about the past, we need more inclusive stories. We need to know more. We need to fill in some of those missing puzzle pieces. And so then the question becomes, where do we look for those? And this is what sort of half of the module is about on smallpox. Where do you find the stories of people who aren't obvious? And how do we recreate those stories as historians and as scholars? And of course, we have to look to different kinds of archives, right? And this, again, if you could forward the slide, Gabby, would be great. Bhattacharya, again, points the way for students and how to do this. He's done a lot of excavating in South Asia. He's looked at local archives, and he considers the way that sort of local stories, local reports that go into the WHO that kind of get erased and filed and sort of, you can't find them very easily, but he sort of manages to find all these local stories, or sort of local reports, how you can back your way into those and really uncover stories about local labs, about local government systems, about specific health teams that would go out into the world to sort of manage the smallpox eradication program, local workers, local advocates, right? Local translators who had to go with people like Henderson and World Health Organization officials around the world as they sought access to places. And through this work, Bhattacharya has found that the most effective smallpox eradication campaigns were generally those that were based on proactive exchange of ideas locally between field personnel of different backgrounds and different ranks. This was a decentralized way of sharing information, of learning things on the field and letting them sort of go up through the chain of command. It was time consuming. This is plotting work. It takes a great deal of work and a great deal of manpower, but it's quite important. Indeed, we sort of see this best when we look at local health teams on the ground. And you can see some images of local health teams in India here on the slide. These sort of teams of health care workers in India in particular, who are both foreign and local, they had to be on the ground to monitor things, right? You have to survey people, you have to vaccinate people, you have to educate people, you have to accumulate data, and you have to share that information with other people. Really, the only way you can get an accurate picture of what's going on is through the sort of spread out, decentralized eyes on the ground, right? And so this is what the smallpox eradication program was. It was tens of thousands of people sort of moving out around parts of the world where smallpox was endemic, watching people and checking up on them. Once a case was located, for example, once a smallpox case was located, a team would sort of come in, quarantine, isolate an entire village, mass vaccinate everyone in the village, and then move out in concentric circles and keep doing that until they felt sort of secure and safe in it. And then they'd have to watch that space, right? They'd have to survey it. So you can't just declare a region disease-free. It actually has to be constantly monitored and rechecked. right? Disease can hide in plain sight, and people had to constantly be looking out for it. Just to give you an example, during a 6-day period each month in India in the early 1970s, health workers visited every one of the country's 100 million households looking for examples or evidence of smallpox. The scale of this undertaking was breathtaking, right? Some 33,000 district health personnel and more than 100,000 additional field workers conducted house-to-house searches throughout India in the early 1970s. And of course, the information provided by this diverse group of workers proved crucial to the development of really socially and politically acceptable and thus effective policies. So it's like through this minute on the ground work. And this is the sort of information that, when successful, could flow up through this kind of chain of command and help WHO officials and team leaders think about what could be done and how to best do it, right? So while mobile teams traveled around the countryside, you had urban areas, and if Gabby, if you'll forward the slide for me, they would implement and sort of organize big mass campaigns and mass events in advance of the WHO teams coming into a city. They'd have rallies and parades, and they'd have posters. Their posters created in all sorts of languages to encourage vaccinations, especially amongst young children. Perhaps the most unusual example of this was of a sort of program and policy was in India. There was a reward of 100 rupees, which was about $12 US, for the report of any cases of smallpox. The amount of money that was awarded went up as the smallpox cases went down, because they sort of had to calibrate how are we going to get people to report on each other and survey one another. This was highly effective, obviously, because smallpox was ultimately eradicated. But surveillance, of course, came in an increasing cost. And I realize I'm out of time here, so let me just sort of end with a couple of little stories, sort of taking it down even to the more micro level of what this might have looked like. The scholar Paul Greenough has shown that health specialists could become sort of fanatical, right, in their belief in this program. And so much so that forced vaccination of people in countries was not unheard of. One American CDC official who ended up working on the WHO campaign, smallpox eradication campaign, his name was Stanley Music, was in India for years, and he reported, and I quote, "I became so convinced of this program that I did some very excessive things in the name of righteousness," he said. "One of the rules was that everybody gets vaccinated. So I was awful in my conviction of purity and purpose in breaking down doors and vaccinating crying women." He reports that our teams were, and I quote, operated almost military style attacks on infected villages. In a hit and run excitement of such a campaign, women and children were often pulled from under beds, from under doors, from behind, within latrines. People were chased, and when they were caught, we vaccinated them, end of quote. So resistance and anger was not the norm. I don't want to give you that impression at all. But I think, of course, sometimes looking at these stories on the fringes is often where we find the most important information. Health officials worried a great deal about how to get the last people vaccinated, right? How do you reach this, what was called herd immunity then, and that's of course a term we are familiar with now. How do you manufacture this herd immunity through mass vaccinations? How do you vaccinate people who don't want to be vaccinated, right? And if you switch the slide, Gabby, to the last slide, I was actually reminded of these stories last week. The New York Times had a story about one woman, Tina Sandry, who has tried to slowly and methodically convince the people who work at the nursing home she works at outside of the DC area to get vaccinated. And seeing this story made me be like, oh, I got to talk about this. I want to talk about the works in progress. She has written, and this story is about her experience of trying to get her fellow healthcare workers vaccinated, who were very skeptical of it. She said many refused, and her goal was to persuade people, not to pressure them, right? But to do that, she realized she had to, and I quote, "I had to know an awful lot," she said. She found that there was no unifying story, right, behind the people's refusal. There was no one reason. Instead, and I quote again, she had to know each story. I had to learn them all, she said, end quote, in order of having a chance of convincing just one person. And I will end there. So Philip, turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my presentation? No, okay, let me see, try again. Goodness. Okay, can you see my presentation now?
It's on its
Perfect.
way. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for attending, and I appreciate the Humanities Center and CSSH for giving me this opportunity to present our module and this module from the Pandemics Teaching Initiative. Hold on one second. Let me make sure if this can go. Oh, here we go. So I also want to thank my colleague, Professor Gretchen Heefner, for serving as the inspiration for this module and for introducing me to teaching the Cold War, the global Cold War. As Professor Brown mentioned, she's the one who developed the course. I just had the good fortune of being able to teach it when she was on leave. And yeah, so I very much appreciate the fact that Professor Heefner has served as such a model for that. So Professor Heefner and I developed our unit, Disease, Diplomacy, and Science in the Cold War, because we wanted to bring a historical perspective to looking at the COVID-19 pandemic of today. Last spring, as we entered the first months of the pandemic, I spent a lot of time trying to educate myself on COVID-19. But like a very good historian, I wanted to better understand the current moment by looking at historical cases and historical parallels. Basically, I wanted to explore and ask whether something like this has happened before, and if so, what happened, how did people and government deal with it, and what can we learn from it? And my own module, Influenza, Pandemics, and Global Health in the Cold War, tries to answer these questions by looking at past pandemics. So when we're talking about past pandemics, most scholar, journalist, or policymaker will invariably refer to this case, the 1918-1919 pandemic, more popularly known as the Spanish flu. This was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, if not the deadliest pandemic in human history. According to the CDC, the pandemic infected more than 500 million people worldwide, 1/3 of the world's population, and it killed an estimated 50 million worldwide, including 675,000 in the US. But as deadly as this pandemic was, it was not the only influenza pandemic of the 20th century. In fact, it was followed later by two other major pandemics, the so-called Asian flu of 1957 to 1958, and the so-called Hong Kong flu of 1968 to 1969. These two pandemics are far less remembered today, probably because they were far less lethal when you compare them to the 1918 pandemic. They infected millions across the world, but they each killed at most an estimated 1 to 2 million people. These numbers are still very sizable, and they are still very sobering, but they are dwarfed by the carnage of the 1918 pandemic. Still, I believe that these two pandemics were worth remembering for many reasons. The Asian flu and Hong Kong flu were respectively the second and third deadliest pandemics of the 20th century. Yet I have realized that there is actually little, surprisingly little of history about these two pandemics. And more importantly, these two pandemics broke out at the height of the Cold War. This was a time when the world was divided into rival camps, a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were jostling for global supremacy and global influence. So if there was a moment when global cooperation was needed to tackle a problem, it would seem unlikely that such a moment would have happened during the Cold War. But yet, even in this geopolitical environment, international cooperation did prevail. That international cooperation was critical to exchanging scientific information, which helped governments around the world prepare for the pandemic and help scientists develop effective vaccines. So my module looks at the history of international cooperation that was critical to combating these two pandemics. How did this happen? You can review my module for more details, but let me just provide a very quick overview in this presentation. So a key institution that fostered international cooperation was the WHO, founded in 1945. Now, one of the WHO's first initiatives was establishing the so-called Global Influenza Program in 1947. So drawing from their own experiences from the Spanish flu, scientists and diplomats identified influenza as a potential menace to world health and a very likely candidate for future pandemics. So this was one of the first initiatives that they wanted to look at. Now, a key pillar of the global influenza program is the Global Influenza Surveillance Network, which is now called the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System. Now, this network included laboratories or influenza centers around the world, monitoring local conditions. They reported any cases of influenza outbreaks or epidemics through weekly epidemiological reports or emergency bulletins. These influenza centers were also responsible for identifying the type of virus, which was key to developing appropriate vaccines. Now, this international reach of the Global Influenza Surveillance Network was critical to combating influenza. Without adequate surveillance, an outbreak in one part of the world could quickly spread to another part of the world. But even more importantly, new strains of influenza viruses constantly mutated. They often emerged in unexpected places and were transmitted in unexpected ways. And again, without a sample of the virus, scientists cannot develop any sort of effective vaccines. Now, in both the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu, securing samples of the virus helped scientists develop effective vaccines in just mere months after the first outbreaks were detected. And this rapid turnaround in the development and deployment of vaccines ultimately limited the morbidity and mortality of both pandemics. So in other words, it could have been much worse. Again, everyone is welcome to review my module for more details, but let me just use one case, the Hong Kong flu, to illustrate how this international cooperation unfolded and how the Global Influenza Surveillance Network operated. So the pandemic that would eventually be known as the Hong Kong flu originated in South China. News about this emerging outbreak slowly trickled out of China in the early summer of 1968, but no one initially appreciated the scope and the virulence. But by July, however, the flu arrived in Hong Kong in force. An estimated 15% of the city's residents fell ill. The number of deaths was relatively low, but the suffering was widespread. Patients with fevers, chills, muscle weaknesses, and other symptoms simply overwhelmed local hospitals. Now, the Hong Kong flu eventually arrived in the United States by early September 1968. The US recorded its first cases from soldiers returning from Vietnam. It then recorded a few more isolated cases among the civilian population by early October. But by early December, cases were reported in all 50 states, and the pandemic led to closure of schools in at least 23 states. It also placed enormous strains on hospitals and other social services. In cities and towns across the country, many workers were unable to show up for work at the height of the pandemic in late 1968. Now, as virulent as the flu was, its damage was fortunately limited because scientists had already developed a vaccine. In the United States, the first 1 million doses were released in November 1968, with another 9 million by January 1969. And this turnaround was due in no small part to the efforts by the WHO. During the pandemic's first month back in Hong Kong, Dr. Wai Kwan Chang, who was the head of the Queen Mary Hospital virus laboratory, was able to quickly test and identify and isolate this new influenza strain. Dr. Chang had the necessary resources because her laboratory a few years before was designated as an influenza center by the WHO and included into part of this global influenza surveillance network. And just weeks after the first outbreaks were reported in Hong Kong, Dr. Chang would send these samples to other WHO influenza centers in the United Kingdom, the United States. And after more testing, these centers confirmed her findings. And less than 2 months after this outbreak was first detected in Hong Kong, the WHO was able to alert the world of this incipient pandemic. Now, in the United States, this early warning was critical. American scientists and the American government originally did not predict such a virulent flu would break out. In fact, they thought this was going to be a relatively mild flu season. So were it not for the work of Dr. Chang and the warning from the WHO, the United States and the rest of the world would have been even less likely prepared. So I'm going to go ahead and just really quickly wrap up here that this critical role by the WHO was recognized by widely within the scientific community and around the world. Dr. Maurice Hillman, who has been hailed as the father of the modern vaccine, basically credited the WHO for its surveillance and early detection. I should also say that within the Cold War might have divided the world into rival camps, but the Soviet Union was a part of this global influenza surveillance network. So it was able to keep track of the virus and the pandemic as it spread around the world. And it was able to be kept up to date on all of this information. And this cooperation was appreciated by the Soviet scientists. Here I have a quote from Dr. Viktor Janadov, who stressed the importance of international cooperation, international coordination. So at least in this case, the Soviet Union recognized that countries had a stake in combating the pandemic, regardless of geopolitical rivalries. So what can we learn from the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu pandemics? So obviously the Cold War is over, and we live in a very different time today. But I do think they can provide some lessons. The pronouncement that diseases know no borders is very cliched. But frankly, it's true. A problem that does not respect borders need an international solution to combat it. So this is a reminder from the past that it's especially important for the future. And we have to keep this in mind as we think about future pandemics, because there could be a very strong possibility that an influenza pandemic might break out. There is no quota for pandemics, even after the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will go ahead and wrap up my presentation here. Thank you.
We welcome your questions.
Laurie, I would be glad to ask the first question, and then I'm hoping more of our colleagues will jump in as well. Gretchen and Philip, thank you so much for this presentation. It's really been wonderful to see the collaborations that have come out of the initiative, which was initiated by the Humanities Center at the Ethics Institute in collaboration with others as well. I'm going to ask this, partially as a fellow historian, but I think the question is hopefully of interest to all of us from different angles. I really thought your emphasis on how important international collaboration is just makes so much sense. I also, Philip, remember your very powerful op-ed in the Washington Post last spring when you drew links between the Hong Kong flu reaction and the failures of the moment. I'm just curious because, and I don't know whether it's a totally fair question, but I'm curious about perhaps linking a little bit the conversation that happened as we were all coming on when Philip was just coming off a very important event that he was part of, and this discussion. And so what I'm curious about is, I was so struck by what each of you said about how little is known. Of course, I'm also very struck at this point how, to me, the 1920s at this point makes so much more sense, with more of an emphasis on actually thinking about the aftermath of disease there as well, when of course that was not how I taught the 20s for a long time. In any case, I am curious whether each of you would just want to say a few more words with having lived through the last year, whether you would want to already redo the module, or alternatively, if you don't want to redo the module, whether you would want to send historians down specific paths. So for example, I mean, I think again, what each of you said about surveillance is so interesting, right? And at the same time, so incredibly complicated. It's also, of course, so interesting that the Cold War was also a war in which modes of racialization did not stop, right? But they took different forms at different moments. And these questions did not seem to play a major role, at least not in the ways in which probably mostly the high level and the mid-level bureaucrats reflect on this. And as we know, scientists like often to say that these questions, that they are just about science and that these kinds of questions don't influence their decisions. I mean, this Cold War is also, of course, the Cold War. I know I'm going in all kinds of directions and you can just pick and choose what you want. But I know that for each of you, teaching the Cold War is partially also about the presence of empire and then the aftermath of empire, right? And yet those terms didn't come up per se in, again, the very short briefings that you could only give us today. In any case, just pick and choose if any of this resonates with you. If you see particular directions that you want historians to go, I know that definitely filling in the puzzles more is part of what Gretchen was calling for. But also, are there parts of these big questions that, you know, COVID-19 has, right? I think most of us would say that COVID-19 is showing with X-rays issues that have, in fact, much, much longer histories. And then at the same time, it's also leading to certain manifestations of conflict, for example, that are obviously then, again, bound to ultimately also probably influence our look at the past. In any case, I know it's very broad ranging, but if you want to just pick and choose something from that, what would you want others to do if you don't want to talk about whether you already would redo this, you know, just a year later at all, which I can understand if you don't want to do that. It seems very fresh. It seems excellent what you're doing. I don't want to say anything that deters from that, but just curious.
Philip, you want me to take it on first?
Go ahead, please.
So the short answer to your question is I don't actually think I would redo it. And the reason I say that is because actually a lot of the questions that you brought up are partially answered.
And we just couldn't get to all of them, right?
And I see that in part because, I mean, a lot of the issues, I mean, that's one of the nice things about actually being a historian, right, is that you get this long view. So you can kind of always sit back and be like, I already knew that. I already knew that. I already knew that. If you're not looking at the present for the answers to things, it's kind of easier to parse the details and what happened. And so I think at least in particularly like, and Philip and I set up the sort of smallpox versus the influenza modules, thinking we actually initially thought the influenza module was going to have more conflict involved in it because there were actually issues of like, who's to blame, right? It was called the Hong Kong flu, the Asian flu. Like there was very specific tropes around these illnesses. And so we were thinking, oh, is this the story of conflict and smallpox? Maybe that's more the story of collaboration on this international plane. It turns out that's not quite what we found, right? But that's okay. We still allow, I think, the space for students to kind of play around with these ideas. And in the story of smallpox eradication, empire is enormously important because it's one of the reasons many people in India don't want to get vaccinated when they have these like World Health Organization people showing up. And there's conversations about like, you know, local governance and what does this mean? And there's conversations that take place amongst the national government in India with the World Health Organization about who's in control and who gets to, so there's so many things we just couldn't get at, which do come out as if people want to sort of parse some of these issues. I think, interestingly, I don't quite know how to answer this question, but my instinct on this is I am comforted looking to the past because the institutions often work despite the political noise. And so that is what happened. I mean, it's not always perfect and people don't always act wonderfully in the way we would like to write their stories. But, you know, the smallpox eradication program is amazing. It worked. I mean, they got rid of a disease that was pretty horrific. And it worked despite right, what was going on in the world in the late 1960s and 1970s. Like that was not a good time for Cold War politics, right? I mean, and so these people just put their heads down and they got their stuff done and they didn't make noise and they found the money where they had to and they got it done because they believed in the project. And so there is a little bit of a story of sometimes maybe don't look too far because you don't want to mess it up too much. I don't know, I'm a little like, maybe we don't want to look under the hood too much because you don't want to mess up what might actually function if we ignore it, which is a terrible lesson, I realize, but that's sort of my instinct is like, oh, I don't know. If we let institutions work, they can do good things.
Thank you very much, Professor Heefner, Gretchen, for that answer, and Dean Poyger. I can go ahead and answer your question about how I would do this differently. Just like my colleague, I probably would not do it that much more differently, because I think that the reason why I went into this influenza pandemic, this rabbit hole, despite not being within my own specialty, was that last spring I was getting many articles, shown to me about how certain media, including newspapers like the New York Post or the the Wall Street Journal, were trying to argue that when you look at the past pandemics, like the Hong Kong flu, it wasn't so bad. People didn't need to mask up. They were going about their lives, and the world didn't shut down. See, we don't need to panic. And when I actually decided to look at the actual history, that's when I actually realized that there was also this really critical role for international cooperation, and also this infrastructure that I didn't even know about. I had to also educate myself on the epidemiology of influenza and about the importance of international surveillance. I mean, you can't do surveillance domestically; you have to do it globally. And so these were sort of the main things that I went into in developing this module. And I think the lessons that I pointed out, which is the importance of international cooperation, I think it still stands. I mean, the WHO, let me be very clear, has a lot of problems, which I have not, talked about. But I don't think that the answer is simply walking away from the institution and letting other countries like, say, China, play a much larger role in this. Not that, whatever you may think about the intentions of the People's Republic, the one way to make sure that international institutions do their work is for the international community to be engaged in using them. And so that's one thing that I would say that I would not do differently. But there is one thing I would might do differently, is maybe I should have emphasized, the problem of maybe anti-Asian discrimination and bigotry, which I actually alluded to that in my essay in the Washington Post, about how it stirred a little bit of xenophobia. This was not something that I looked at very deeply, although I did find many articles and advertisements that were not explicitly racist per se, but they definitely played on stereotypes. In the aftermath of the Hong Kong flu, there was many stores or companies or businesses that had these advertisements, the post Hong Kong flu sale, which would feature an Asian looking person. This is at a time when Asians were not very visible. So the one time that they got the visibility was when they were put as this sort of representative of of this disease, in the aftermath. And of course, it wasn't, again, directly racist per se, but it was very problematic. And this is something I probably would have probably maybe talked a bit more about in the module, but can't talk about everything. So
Thank you both.
This is fascinating. And it does suggest that we should all be driven to the module itself. Professor Elisa Lincoln, we also have a question in the chat from Marty Blatt and then Sari Altschuler.
So I will just say most of it actually, Philip, you just covered. I was actually going to ask how much you dealt with that in the module, how much you thought about that, especially in light of the current moment, right? And one of the things many people have probably noticed is we've stopped calling the variants by their nation of origin. They're now using numbers. But I personally was struck that move did not happen until it was South Africa and Brazil, right? That there was, until then, we were still using nations of origin as part of the name of the pandemic. So you already spoke to that. And I guess the only other thing is, Gretchen, I was so struck when you said, institutions can work, and seeing how the CDC and the WHO worked in the 60s and 70s, I was furiously Googling, because that historical period was also Tuskegee. That was the height of the Tuskegee experiments at CDC. And so for me, it was this moment of realizing my bias of, I think of that as an institution that wasn't functioning in that historical time period. And you pointed out, there was this other whole thing going on, that the institution was functioning incredibly well. So I really appreciate you sort of making that point about when institutions functions and when they don't. There was actually, when you said Henderson, there's a Henderson, I don't know if it's a policy or a rule. I think it's 1943. The Henderson rule was that, I'll have to look it up, but it's It's when they started requiring testing for STDs among populations, and that very much fed the Tuskegee era. And so I was curious if it was the same Henderson. It looks like it was not. It looks like it was a prior person. But yeah, no, Philip, thank you very much. I mean, you answered my question fully.
And I missed Laura Green. So Laura, I think you're up.
Thanks, Laurie. I will try to be quick. I have a question. It seemed to me that there were some potentially productive, probably superficial, but maybe potentially productive, certainly for students, to bang together tensions between Gretchen's framing and Philip's framing. And I just wanted to see if you both thought those were real or if I'm just making them up, but or if there's something useful about them. One is, I was very struck by Gretchen's description of sort of the necessity for local ownership, right, of the interventions, which I feel is sort of like a story we keep hearing, and I don't understand why we can't just decide it's like just sort of what has to happen. But anyway, so I felt like there was a potentially a tension between that and then Philip's framing, which was about the necessity for global intervention. So I was wondering how those two things relate to each other. And then I also thought there was potentially an interesting kind of historiographic tension, which was, Gretchen, you emphasized that we simply don't know enough, right, is what you said. Like, and I didn't exactly hear that as a call to know more, which you just said. I just sort of heard it as a description. But then Philip was very intent on saying, we can look back and draw some lessons. So I was just wondering, and again, I just think those would be such wonderful sort of different frameworks just for students to ponder. But I was wondering if either of you wanted to say anything about those relationships.
I can go ahead and try to answer that. Gretchen and I have released this module once when I taught the Global Cold War last semester, and I think students received it positively. And I think, if I recall, they did pick up on that slightly about the tensions, about the different emphasis of our modules. But of course, the students really spent most of the time just trying to grapple with like what happened. And I think that maybe if given more time and more thought, especially from me, we could have maybe thought about ways to either harmonize or not just harmonize, but have it speak more directly to each other. But we were motivated primarily by looking at using historical cases to see how we can understand the present moment. Yeah, and I don't remember what the other part of the other question is. Gretchen, would you like to take that?
Yeah, Laura, I'm glad you mentioned those things because I mean, as I said earlier, one of the ways that Philip and I were initially thinking about it was like I would be showing like cooperation and he would be showing conflict, and that wasn't like we were thinking that we would kind of set it off. And actually, I think the sort of in a sense type of historians that Philip and I are lend itself to actually like our modules being a little bit different, which I actually really like the idea of students being able to pick that out also. I mean, I was surprised at how much I just got really, I mean, I wasn't surprised. This is the kind of history I like, so I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was trying to tell this like high level policy story of the Cold War. And then I ended up like, it's all about the local stories, And so that was not my intention, but I just kept digging into it. And I was like, oh, nothing makes sense unless you start to figure out what was going on the ground. And so I think it would make sense for us to maybe like highlight this sort of difference in the way we're narrating the stories and let students argue about that. I actually think that would be a really cool way into a really interesting way in for students to sort of explore what historians do.
I think so too.
Even when their offices are next door.
Yeah, it really seems like a very dynamic learning process. There are several questions in the chat about the role of the World Health Organization, whether there was something about the conditions of the Cold War that are different from those today that that created an environment for success. But just mindful of the time as well, I'm going to ask Sari to pose her question, and then you take as much as you can in the time remaining.
Great. Well, yeah, just to echo everyone else, I thought that this is an extremely rich module and also just a great presentation. So thank you both so much. My question is about what histories of disease we choose to talk about and which ones we don't, and which pandemics matter and which pandemics don't matter. So you probably know we're actually living through 3 pandemics right now, but we don't talk about it that way. 3 global pandemics, cholera, HIV/AIDS, and also COVID. And so I'm wondering, in terms, like, just as historians, if you have gotten more out of curiosity, if you've gotten a sense about, you made your own decisions for reasons that seem like pretty clear to me in terms of, narratively, but if you have a broader sense of which kinds of pandemics seem like historical touchstones that are useful and which ones fall through the cracks, easily we could say HIV, AIDS, and cholera aren't really Western problems. And so that's the reason why, we aren't really talking about them as global pandemics, even though they are. And so I'm just wondering, since you are telling in some ways a global story, a non-Western story, like if you, just had a sense about, how and why things seem to be useful, certain pandemics seem to be useful historical lessons and other ones don't.
Yeah, I actually think it's a great question, particularly in light of the fact that in at least the United States, it was the flu of 1918 that's gotten all of the attention, right? And it's because it happened in the United States, right? So people are like, look what happened in New York in 1918 versus here. Like it's the pictures are obvious, right? Like Yale, immediately put out pictures of all the beds in its gyms, from 100 years ago. And then again today, in their preparation last spring. So it was like the stories were so obvious to people. I actually was teaching a class this semester on the origins of today, and we had a module on pandemics, and my students almost to a T were like, I can't believe I never knew about any of these. I had them, and they were like, I didn't know anything. I had no idea there was ever a global pandemic before, and I gave them a timeline of 15, and they had to do research on them. And they chose the Black Plague, anywhere from the Black Plague to cholera to yellow fever to the HIV crisis they also looked into. So they got a sort of broader perspective, but they were all, and every single one of them said, I can't believe I didn't know about this. It's just, there's so much, right? It's hard to know what to focus on. I think for our purposes, we chose these because we thought that the world collaboration around them was the story we wanted to tell. We were really interested in that story of disease diplomacy, what is going on, beyond the noise. So it was specific. We recognized these 2 as cases that other scholars had looked at. This is not our research, right? And so we had to find, and again, that's selecting from what people are actually telling us about, which is problematic. I do think there's a huge problem in the United States, particularly of telling the stories that are useful to us. And so you're not going to hear as much about cholera, right? Malaria people wrote a lot about malaria in the mid-century, which is interesting, which gets into this Cold War question, which I can answer really quickly, which is, yes, the Cold War mattered a great deal to how the WHO operated and what diseases were actually focused on. So for example, smallpox became a focus of the World Health Organization because the Soviets were like, every once in a while it crops up here because we're kind of close to countries where it's endemic. And they were like, it'd be cheaper in the long run for us to get rid of smallpox than to have to keep dealing with it in our own borders. So they threw their weight behind the World Health Organization. And then later the United States did, partly because their malaria campaign had failed. They wanted to sort of spearhead this global malaria campaign that was a miserable failure. And so they sort of both got behind it, but they would kind of agree in the World Health Organization, and then the United States would go home and be like, we have to do this for the hearts and minds, right? We can't let the Soviets win this particular war. So the Cold War was deeply involved in the way that sort of the world of high politics dealt with it. People under the radar, again, tried to ignore it, sort of they kept their head down and just did what they had to do.
Thank you very much for all of these questions. I guess from my perspective, one thing I didn't really talk about in this presentation, and not all that much in the module, was that I was actually interested in how did the Hong Kong flu affect Hong Kong? And so in one way that I would like to actually try to decenter this this global pandemic story from not just an American story, but as a global story. I tried to understand what was going on in different parts of the world. That's how I started realizing, oh yes, this stuff was also spreading throughout Europe and also behind the Iron Curtain, but also just looking at various writings by ethnic Chinese themselves or people in East Asia. I wanted to basically give voice to some of their experiences, especially to that doctor, Dr. Chang in Hong Kong. Many of the original sources that I got, I didn't even know she was a she. It just said Dr. Her by her initial in Chang. I actually had to do a lot of digging to identify her and get a photo of her and also get her name in Chinese, which I didn't show in this presentation, but I eventually did. So that was just very, eye-opening for me. As for the role of politics in the Cold War in combating these pandemics, I fully agree with my colleague, Professor Heefner, in the sense that in a strange way, the Cold War rivalry made both superpowers actually eager to act in the sense of national honor or like winning hearts and minds. I don't know what, in our current world, if, absent that kind of mentality or mindset of, making sure that the good name of the United States / the Soviet Union or whatever, we're trying to win over allies, throughout the world. If, absent that mentality, how will that affect international cooperation? I think that's a story that's still unfolding right now. But nonetheless, from my perspective, I fully appreciated, again, these invisible institutions and networks that undergirded global health or how pandemics were dealt with in the past. So that's sort of the lesson that, if nothing else, if students can take away from this, if nothing else, they can just say, wow, this has happened before. Even if the details and are different, it just shows us that if it happened before and it can be dealt with, it means that it's perfectly possible for us to deal with it now with better knowledge, better knowledge, better science, and so forth. So that's how I'll end with that.
I'm mindful of the time, but it's clear this conversation could go on a long time. And to Dean Poiger's point, that there are many directions that we could pursue. I wonder, Sari, about the difference between the pandemics you're talking about and how swiftly we seem to deal with Ebola. By contrast, we're not going to answer it. I do want to thank everybody for coming. I wonder, Dean Poiger, if you want to just put some closure to the series. You're muted, Dean. You're muted.
That would be an appropriate closure, since that has been a theme of the year, especially for me, being muted at the wrong moment. In any case, what I was saying is I wanted to thank the Humanities Center, Laurie, Sari, and also everybody for coming together on a regular basis for Faculty Works in Progress. I do share, of course, very much the hope that we will do so much more in person as vaccinations increase, and at the same time also remain curious where there are some moments and where in fact we will be in mixed modalities or where we will choose Zoom, because quite frankly, we have had often more people in conversations on Zoom than we have often in 9009 or 310. But again, all that is something that, like this year, we will need to shape together, and we will need to think about together and get people's ideas. I'm really grateful for being part of a college that thinks always, where so many people think always critically about both past, present, and also try to shape a better future. And so certainly these Faculty Works in Progress interactions have been an important part of our intellectual vibrancy and representing that to one another, as has of course been the work that all of you are doing in the context of teaching, that you are doing in the context of research, in the context of building partnerships also beyond the university. So thanks so much. I hope that you will also come to the faculty staff celebration on Reading Day in order to celebrate with teaching award winners, staff award winners, and find some time to take for yourselves over the summer, as well as continued energy for building. what we can do in order to make the world and Northeastern better as well. Take good care. See you in other contexts, I hope.
Thank you. That was
Thank
really
you.
great.